Well, evening all, and I'm Andrew Lane, the chair of the National Pharmacy Association, for those who don't know. Couple of housekeeping, I suppose, issues that we just have to address this evening. The first is we've got a centenary hashtag, and it's hashtag NPA 100 years for those who are on the tweet buttons or the various social media. And in terms of questions this evening, you may have them, but we're not answering questions verbally this evening. But if you put them in the chat, and we can then come back to you on any questions you might have. So, like I said, welcome to this evening's event. It marks the centenary of the National Pharmacy Association. It's 100 years ago this month that the NPA formally met for the first time. We had originally planned to hold this meeting on the anniversary of the first board meeting on the 14th of April, but we postponed that event as a mark of respect for HRH Duke of Edinburgh, as that date fell within the official period of the morning following his death. We'll be celebrating the centenary throughout the year, developing a centenary vision for the future of independent community pharmacy, showcasing members that have been with us on the journey. And tonight, I'm also pleased to announce a partnership to support 3 mental health charities: Mind, Inspire, and the Scottish Association for Mental Health. I'm delighted to be joined for this evening's events by NPA members, members of staff of the association, and a number of stakeholders in government, regulators, and other pharmacy bodies. And our panel for this evening of Dr. Ian Cubbin, Rena Barai, both members of the NPA board, and RPS President Sandra Gidley. We're also going to hear about the history of the NPA and independent community pharmacy over the past 100 years, and a view on the future opportunities for the association and our members as we think about the decades to come, before a reflection from the President of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, Sandra Gidley, and a brief introduction to our charity partners. But first, we're going to show a short video to whet your appetite.
Being a community pharmacist can be very isolating. As a third-generation pharmacist, I know this better than most. With the NPA, you're never alone, which is why a member of my family has been a member of the NPA for over 60 years.
first of all, I'm going to introduce, as I said, Ian Cubbin. Ian represents the NPA members from Merseyside and Cheshire. He studied at Sunderland School of Pharmacy, and actually, so did I. He initially joined the family firm, James Cubbin and Sons, and later read his doctorate jointly at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne and the University of Sunderland. When he returned to the Northwest, he became a teacher practitioner at John Moores University. Ian is currently managing director of James Cubbin and Son, who operate 5 pharmacies in the Wirral. Among a number of other posts, Ian is also the PSNC representative for the Mersey region and a member of the board of assessors for the GPHC. And generations of pharmacists have been introduced to the profession by Ian, and he's very well placed to give us the historical perspective as the NPA celebrates his centenary. So we're now going to run a video with Ian Cubbin telling us all about the history.
It's a real privilege to talk about the history and the founding of the NPA. And of course, in order to understand that, we have to think about where pharmacy came from and what indeed were its origins. And they begin with the livery companies and indeed the surgeons, the barber surgeons and the physicians. And all 3 of those roles, physician, surgeon and apothecary, have been interlinked and overlapped in the last 500 years. The first attempt at legislation to distinguish the overlapping roles was made by Henry VIII. In 1518, he established the Royal College of Physicians, and in 1540, he approved the merger of the Guild of Surgeons with the Company of Barbers. They, of course, became the Royal College of Surgeons in 1800. At the same time that he did that, he gave the physicians rights to inspect apothecary shops for the quality of their medicines. They were also able to prosecute those who practiced physic and impacted on their monopoly. Not much different from today, some of us might say. And so it became generally accepted that physicians advised and prescribed medicines, apothecaries compounded and dispensed those remedies, and surgeons performed all the physical interventions from bloodletting to amputation. So what happened after that? Well, the next major landmark was the forming of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. This span out of the grocers and was incorporated as a livery company in London by Royal Charter in 1617. And until 1922, they manufactured and sold medicines. And this period, 1920 to 22, is quite an important one in the formation of the NPA. In 1704, the apothecaries won a really important case in the House of Lords, known as the Rose case. And this permitted the apothecaries to both prescribe and dispense. And then the Apothecaries Act in 1815 gave the society the right to examine and grant licenses to practice medicine in both England and Wales. So at that point, the early 1800s, we began to see the divergence of the 2 professions. There were those who wanted to stay on their premises and compound medicines and see people there. And there were those who wanted to see patients in their own homes. And from that, we see the founding of the general practitioners. In 1841, of course, the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain was formed. And by 1842, it had 2,000 members. Many of those members in the early days had dual membership. And trying to put this in context, what was happening to patients throughout this journey? It's often been quoted that if you could go back in time to somewhere between 1819 and 1827, and you happened to be walking down an English lane and met a doctor who undoubtedly would be riding while you were walking, And if you were lucky enough to persuade him that you could have a consultation, presumably having the right fee, at that point, there was a 50% chance that you would benefit from the encounter. And that's really saying that this was the first time that the odds were ever stacked in favour of the patient. So turning back now to the Pharmaceutical Society, which was incorporated by Royal Charter in 1843, that continued to have a function both as the membership organisation and the regulator until 2011. And it was only then that the Society's function was split and the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain ceased to exist, and the Royal Pharmaceutical Society became the membership organisation and the General Pharmaceutical Council became the regulator. You would expect, knowing that I spend most of my life in and around Liverpool, that I would want to talk about the rather idiosyncratic work that took place in Liverpool in 1849. That was when Jacob Bell, one of the founders of the Pharmaceutical Society, travelled up and addressed a group of perhaps 40 or 50 chemists, which led directly to the formation of the Liverpool Chemists Association. And they chose that name in preference to calling themselves the Liverpool branch of the Pharmaceutical Society, so that they could encourage those who were engaged in the profession but didn't want to become members to join them. And they remained a separate society until 1922, when they formally engaged with the RPS. So we now had the Pharmaceutical Society and we had the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries, but the world began to change. It changed noticeably in 1914. And by 1918, society was a very different place. And so it was that the government, in the aftermath of the First World War, had decided that it wanted to impose all kinds of reforms with regards to wages and working conditions. And the Pharmaceutical Society was trying to act effectively as the union for pharmacy. And it was at this point, in 1920, that a member of the Joint Industrial Council, Arthur Henry Jenkin, he was a hospital pharmacist, incidentally, was successful in attaining a court injunction. This was granted on the 9th of October, 1920. And the effect of this injunction was to inhibit the Pharmaceutical Society from acting in any of these matters. They previously failed to come to terms or agreement with the government on the regulation of pay and conditions of the service of the employers it represented. And so it was obvious that we were seeing a split then between the employers and the pharmacists. As a direct consequence of the Jenkins case, the Retail Pharmacy Union was established. And this permitted successful negotiations to be agreed between the professionals and our distinctive body. The Retail Pharmacy Union, this new separate body, was known as a union of retail employer chemists for the protection of trade interests, and was officially formed in January 1921. This happened at the time of the transfer of the Central Checking Bureau, along with the Bureau staff, from the Pharmaceutical Society. That bureau was headed up by Mr. George Mallinson. Mr. Mallinson, of course, would become secretary of the RPU after his resignation from the society. And it was decided that he would receive a salary of £500 per annum. Mr. Mallinson brought from the society the spheres of work and influence that were judged to be out of their powers. The RPU combined in 1921 with the Chemists Defence Association and the local association's executive. The CDA was established in 1899, and the aim of the partnership with the RPU was to prevent a conflict of interest and service duplication, as the CDA also provided insurance and legal advice. And it is in this way that we can see how our present day society has formed, with this insurance arm very clearly stitched in to the membership organisation. The local associations executive had been established by the Pharmaceutical Society to handle negotiations with the government concerning the National Health Insurance Scheme. Throughout the existence of the RPU, around 60% of the income came from the levies imposed on local pharmaceutical committees by the local associations executive for the running of the National Health Insurance Checking Bureau. Had the Pharmaceutical Society not moved the work of the NHI to the RPU, it poses doubts as to whether the RPU would have become successful and whether it would indeed have survived to the organisation that's now celebrating its centenary. By 1925, we had become a great success with 7,000 member shops, 115 branches, and by 1930, 9/10 of chemist shops in England and Wales were members. In 1932, the RPU was renamed the National Pharmaceutical Union, and as we know, 45 years later in 1977, it became the National Pharmaceutical Association. And then even in this century, we've had a further change with the slight revision in 2005 to the National Pharmacy Association. The NPA has always been involved in protecting its members and also in regulation. And if we go right back to our early days in the first conference in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1921, Mr. Mallinson at that point expressed the RPU's aim in amending the dangerous drugs regulations in order to prohibit the casual over-the-counter sale of substances containing opium and cocaine. And of course, today we recognise that this was subsequently incorporated in the Pharmacy Act of 1933. And it was at that point that we begin to see the value of the association in terms of dealing with counterfeit and fraudulent medicines. And this work, as we know, has gone on right into the present century with Falsification of Medicines Act and FMD. From its earliest times, the RPU has been involved in the training and education of pharmacists and their assistants. We have in our possession a series of business training courses from the 1920s, rather exciting in as much as we actually know who the owner was of course number 550. It was a W.E. Barber who had a pharmacy in Blackpool. And in the records that we have, we see that there were 5 modules that were covered in this early training course: window display, commercial law, advertising and sales, letter writing, and retail selling and shop management. George Mallinson himself wrote to every candidate and explained that at the end of the course there would be an examination and that it was incumbent on candidates to make sure that they got to the local centre so that that would minimise the inconvenience and expense of travel. We have the minutes from the North Staffordshire branch, Stoke-on-Trent branch of the RPU, and in their meeting of March the 23rd, 1925, when Mr. Mallinson came to address them, he spoke of the lessons provided on modern training methods, and he hoped that in future, and this is the rather nice bit, it would be considered essential for an applicant for an assistantship to possess the RPU certificate. Testimony to the value of the RPU training comes, strangely enough, from an article in the C&D from April 1923, in which Mr. Keith, who was the then president of East London Pharmacists Association, highlighted the lack of education for assistants in the 1920s and expressed the hope that the RPU course would be the turning point in providing education with a certificate of competence at the end of the course. He noted that the business training course incurred a fee of 5 guineas. And 5 guineas was no small sum, but it's obvious that even at that date, quality doesn't come for nothing. And the course, as we know, has continued to thrive ever since. So the NPA was developing comfortably right through the 30s. But of course, 1939 saw the outbreak of World War II. And Britain, France, the rest of the empire declared war on Germany. And as a consequence of that, the whole pharmaceutical industry was prioritized towards military effort. In America, there was a shortage of sugar, alcohol, and glycerin became an issue. What we saw in England was a movement away from tinctures to liquid extracts. All of this came to lead to a risk that there were dodgy formulations on the market and indeed totally unregulated medicines. In 1939, the so-called Cancer Act prohibited the advertisement of cancer medications by pharmaceutical companies who were making false claims so that patients could be protected from misleading and harmful information involving the treatment. And of course, the Pharmacy and Medicines Act of 1941 involved full disclosure of the active ingredients, a ban on any inducements to the general public, and a restriction on the distribution networks of medicines, all of which were parts of the work that the NPA undertook. Work which we continue to do today in looking after the safety of patients in terms of our work as the independent superintendent for medicines safety. Most of us think of the home of the NPA as being in St Albans, and more particularly in Mallinson House. And Mallinson House, of course, named after George Mallinson, the first Secretary General, who carried out his duties for over 30 years. In 1921, we had our first home in Temple Chambers, which is Temple Avenue and is the heart of the legal district. And that was very clearly a temporary residence. And we moved within the same year to Tavistock Square. The premises that we own, number 19, were in close proximity to BMA House. And indeed in 1926, when we moved out, the BMA demolished the building and incorporated it into their own organisation. After Tavistock Square, we found a home that lasted for nearly 40 years at numbers 4 and 5 Queen's Square, which was again in the heart of the medical area. We were round the corner from the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery. We were near to Great Ormond Street, and it seemed a fitting home. But in the post-war world, central London was in turmoil. It was becoming increasingly expensive, and we moved outside of that area to Enfield. And we were in Enfield until 1965, and some of our older members may remember that we were at 321 Chase Road. But of course, that didn't last, and most of us have felt very comfortable since we moved to a rather magnificent Jacobean building in the centre of St Albans. Training has been at the heart of the services provided by the NPA since 1921. And if we think about what our current provision is, well then We recognise that the GPHC sets the qualifications and work experience requirements for registration as pharmacy technicians. And we at the NPA offer just such an accredited course, a very well respected BTEC course leading to qualification at level 3, which is a registered qualification. This registered course provides employers with the confidence that the staff that they have are fully trained and capable of carrying out the myriad of tasks which fall to us as practicing community pharmacists. The NPA has been constantly evolving in the last 100 years, both in terms of the services it provides and who its members are. We went on in 2008 to realign our services under main directorates such as external affairs, representation, membership services, and of course the segregation of NPAI, our insurance arm. In 2015, we were delighted to see that the Independent Pharmacy Federation took the decision that it should become part of the National Pharmacy Association. And it did so at a time when we altered our membership criteria so that we no longer had public companies, PLCs, as members. We have a number of very important customers amongst the PLCs, but membership is now restricted to independent pharmacies. And during our centenary year, we've been delighted that a number of pharmacies have wanted to be involved and expressed the support that the NPA has given to them over the last century. The National Pharmacy Association represents members and has wide membership across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And that's been very important as devolution to differing extents has taken place in each of those nations. And the NPA has been at the side of community pharmacy, supporting it in those changes. And we have seen a large number of contractual changes that have affected our members. And so through devolution, we see that the pharmacy contract, which is the cornerstone for all of our incomes, has altered radically in Scotland, in Wales, and in Northern Ireland. And it would be wrong for people to think that the NPA is England-centric or England only. Indeed, our support with our country managers is well recognised and vitally important to our members in all of the nations. Community pharmacy in England, of course, faced a particular challenge in 2015 when we took part in the High Court action in order to seek an injunction to stop the government from imposing a new contract. And that was a real display of support from the general public. We provided the largest ever petition to number 10 Downing Street with over 2 million signatures in support of community pharmacy. And that wasn't the only thing we've done. Only last year, we published a report in conjunction with EY, carrying out a survey of our members in order to see what the general health of community pharmacy was in England. And that has been extremely well received and has provided important information in terms of contractual negotiations. In this centenary year, we've been delighted that on the website, we've been able to publish a number of pharmacy stories from long-term members and newer members of the NPA. And so it would come as no surprise to people who belong for any length of time to know that we have stories from Lindsay and Gilmore in Scotland, from Wicker Pharmacy in Sheffield, and indeed a particularly attractive story from Revley's Chemists, which boasts as being the oldest pharmacy in England, having been founded in Burford in 1734. And it has been encouraging for the organisation to have these testimonies as to how much the services that we provide are valued by our members. in concluding this short talk on the last 100 years, I hope it's been possible to show that we were formed as a result of a need to represent independent pharmacists and pharmacy owners, and that in our long history, we have continued to fulfill that role with great effect. And I look forward, as I hope all of you do, to the next 100 years.
Thank you very much, Ian. And obviously that was the past. Now it's back to the future. One thing, interestingly, I feel very underdressed after seeing Dr. Cubbin again, but that doesn't surprise me. Dr. Cubbin always wears his bow tie. He's always immaculate. So thank you, Dr. Cubbin, for that. So Rena, many of you know Rena Barai. She's been an independent contractor since 2003. She's also the community pharmacy lead for her local primary care network. She's previously worked as a hospital pharmacist, primary care pharmacist, and as a CPPE tutor. She's always been a passionate supporter of community pharmacy and keen to promote the profession. She's represented community pharmacy in the media and presented at national conferences, and she's passionate about person-centered care and empowering pharmacy teams to make every contact count. She's currently the NPA nominated representative on the PSNC committee, and Rena's actually going to talk a bit about what brought her into the profession and give us some thoughts on the future challenges for NPA members as we look forward to the years to come.
I'd like to start my look at the future by reflecting on Ian Cubbin's overview of the history of our profession. Just looking back over the years, thinking about the increasing regulation of medication, the mass production of pharmaceuticals, formation of the NHS as well, actually, and the expansion of our role into a more clinical role of the community pharmacist. Now, thinking back to 1921, can you imagine any of the pharmacists who sort of formed the NPA ever imagining what we've been through over this last century? And if they had imagined it, I wonder what they would have imagined the future to look like. And I guess there are certain elements that have stayed the same, haven't they, really? We're still that face-to-face front door to the NHS, which is new, obviously, since the 1940s. But we are still in our pharmacies. We've still got that local presence, which is so important, isn't it? And it's still continued all these years on. So there are so many things that haven't changed. Yet would we have ever imagined that we'd be vaccinating people and, you know, really contributing to a high uptake of vaccinations locally in our populations? Would we have ever imagined that there was a supply chain that stretched across the globe? Would we even have ever imagined that we'd be prescribing ourselves? And actually, if I look back to why I became a pharmacist, you know, for me, it was a very easy choice because I wanted to follow in the footsteps of my father, who was a pharmacist and who'd bought this pharmacy that I now run back in 1979. And for me, I think the thing that always sold it was the patients. You know, I used to love we used to live upstairs on top of our pharmacy, and I always wanted to sit downstairs listening to all the conversations that my dad was having with all the patients coming in and out of the pharmacy, all these cute little babies coming in to be weighed on the weighing scales. And, you know, looking back, nothing really has changed in that sense. You know, we're still that door that's open to the public, and patients still keep coming into our pharmacy to ask for our advice, to ask for our help, to come and get medications. And so that's a really nice thing that's kind of stayed the same throughout. So looking ahead to the next 5, 10, 15, 25, maybe even 100 years, what opportunities are there that we're going to have to navigate over those next few years? And I guess if we just think about currently what we've been doing, just our role in this pandemic, we've been amazing, haven't we? You know, we're going to pat ourselves on the back because actually we have put our patients first, we've kept our doors open. We have been that face-to-face contact that has been much needed in this COVID pandemic. And I'm sure, like me, you've had lots of patients coming in to thank you, lots of cards and gifts and lots of really warm wishes from patients who've really, really appreciated that. And actually our role now as well is setting up COVID vaccination clinics in pharmacies, COVID testing as well. And we really, really have shown that we can provide that extra additional capacity within the NHS. We've actually sort of supported, you know, almost been like a pressure valve, releasing the pressure on other parts of the system. I know, for example, for my pharmacy, we've had lots of patients sort of using my pharmacy as an A&E almost, and definitely as a GP practice as well over this last year of the pandemic. And I guess as we move on past this pandemic, we do need to think about, what are the next steps, and what is there out there that's kind of the next challenge. And actually, how will the way that we've dealt with COVID change the way we interact with patients in the future and how systems operate? I think one thing is still true. We're still going to be there. We're still going to be accessible in our communities. And that's something that's been really, really important. And I think will continue to be important as well, whether that be face-to-face, virtually. I do think we're going to need to think about different ways of working. And actually, if we think about the various things that, for example, Matt Hancock has said recently about the huge problem we have in this country with health inequalities, community pharmacy has got its finger on the pulse of population health. If you think about the sort of public health services we've been providing for years, such as methadone, stop smoking services, some of the newer, identifying blood pressure, high blood pressure cases. There are so many more services that we could provide in our pharmacies that would help the government to tackle these health inequalities. And of course, community pharmacy bucks that inverse care law. There are more pharmacies in areas of deprivation. And actually, these are the areas that we really need to be working on, that these are the people we really need to be helping. Tackling obesity, tackling people who are smoking and trying to help them to give up smoking. There are so many public health issues that we could do so much more for, and actually our patients would really appreciate it too, because we're in those communities, we know them, we've got those relationships already, and we're trusted in our areas. Diagnostics and monitoring disease is really changing as well. If you think about how many patients are now virtually taking measurements of, using pulse oximeters for themselves, blood pressure machines for themselves. We've even got new sensors now that people can put on their skin, and it checks their blood glucose level and then sends the results to a smartphone. I mean, there is so much change, isn't there, in all of this? But actually, the pharmacist is still there to help people to interpret these results. I know in my own pharmacy, we get lots of people asking us questions about what should blood pressure readings be and how do I take them. So there will always be a role of pharmacists in supporting the diagnostics and the virtual monitoring that patients are increasingly doing. But how about artificial intelligence too? Now, this really fascinates me. And I kind of envisage a future, with robots and drones running my pharmacy. And I think, gosh, will I be replaced by a robot or a drone? And I like to think I can't be replaced. And I think that's something that we should all be working to. I think by all means, we need to use automation, robotic technology, drones to support what we do. But actually, we just need to make sure that as pharmacists and as pharmacy owners, we do kind of keep that need for that face-to-face contact and the need for human beings as well. I think it will be very interesting to see where this all goes in the future, especially if we look at things like genomics. I mean, that is really, going to revolutionize healthcare, especially pharmacogenomics, which is likely to have a big impact on the way we sort of considered medicines and how they're prescribed for patients in the UK. And the UK is at the leading edge of all of this. So do we as community pharmacists really understand this emerging science and what our role will be and how this will affect us in the future? And I think just generally, greater automation will be all around us. If we look at, how other things are happening around us, supermarket shopping, all of us use a very well-known company to have things delivered to us very quickly. And are we as pharmacies embracing this automation? Many of you may already have robots and robotic dispensing in your pharmacies. There's also obviously the potential for hub and spoke, which may be available. And I think if we're given the opportunity to use our skills and improve patient outcomes and have those clinical services that we could focus on, I think something like hub and spoke, robotic dispensing is something that's going to be our friend rather than a foe. And I guess the big thing and the big ask is that we all need to really work on making sure that these services are commissioned so that we can become more clinical in the future, and actually appropriately remunerated clinical services as well will be key to this, so that we can really, invest in automation and invest in that technology that we need. There are so many opportunities out there for us to grasp, while some of them are risks as well. And for the NPA, it's nearly been 5 years since we published a set of core beliefs about the unique strengths of community pharmacy and the choices facing our sector. And since then, there's been so many developments in technology and healthcare and the way we, look after patients. Especially the pandemic has really highlighted, and given rise to a lot of new ways of working as well. So my question to you, and something we at the NPA are asking our members, is: are these core beliefs still accurate? Do they still make sense? And I guess several years after they were first written, Do they still stand the test of time, or do we need a post-pandemic overhaul? So our core beliefs are as follows. 1, community pharmacy works. 2, community pharmacy can do so much more. 3, face-to-face care is vitally important. A pharmacy without a pharmacist is not really a pharmacy at all. Community pharmacists are clinicians and the future is clinical. Supply and service go together, and change is inevitable and desirable. So these are our core beliefs, and we're going to be engaging with you over the next few months in trying to get your feedback on whether you still believe these are beliefs that you hold true, that you think define our future. And we'd really encourage you to get in touch with us via the surveys and the emails and the online meetings that we set up with you, because we really want to be the organisation that represents you from past, present and the future. So I think there's a very clear choice for our future in community pharmacy. I imagine and I envisage and I'm hoping to create a pharmacy of the future that is still embedded in local communities, is better integrated with other services around me, has better IT connections, is operating really efficiently at a neighbourhood and population health level. And actually I'm seen as a local health and wellbeing centre and the front door to the NHS. I really think that this is our future, and this is something for us to all be working towards, whether it's by really changing the way we look, the way we work, thinking about all of the things I've just spoken about, automation, genomics, and kind of bringing all of these things into the mix to make sure that we stay true to those values and core beliefs that we have embedded over the last 100 years, and also just continue into the future to hopefully the next 100 years for the next generations of pharmacists. So I believe that all of us want a really fulfilling professional career and to make the greatest possible contribution to the health of our population and the public that we serve in our pharmacies. And so looking forward to the future, I guess I have 3 thoughts for now on how we can prepare ourselves for this future. I think one of the things is just accepting that things are going to change. Even if we look back over the last 100 years, I remember, obviously not 100 years ago, but I do remember when my parents first bought the pharmacy and them thinking about moving from a typewriter to a computer PMR system, for example. And some of these choices that we had to make and the changes that we had to put in place, refits and refurbishments and introducing consultation rooms and things like that. So I think change is inevitable, isn't it? And we're going to need to continuously update ourselves and understand the needs of our patients and the health system as well, and continue to be agile. Number 2, I think it's going to be really, really important that we understand our true USP, so our unique selling point. And if that's going to be procurement and supply and logistics of supply, then that's great. Or if it's going to be moving to a clinical future and actually, making sure that we've got the knowledge of the health needs of our population and we're able to provide that face-to-face care. So be that being an independent prescriber, being able to listen to people's chests and look in people's throats and ears, and really kind of expanding on that USP of ours. And I guess finally, the most important thing for me is that we're going to have to make sure and really work hard at making sure we have confidence in ourselves, being the sort of professional that the public can go to in their time of need, and making sure that they have confidence in using their local pharmacist as well, making sure that we stay accessible, stay knowledgeable, stay competent, and above all, stay compassionate and caring.
We are now going to go as planned to Sandra Gidley. I think we said that obviously Sandra's here, she's live. I'm going to welcome her. She's president of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. Sandra's very well known, but for those who don't know her, she was a community pharmacist and very active in local politics before entering Parliament in 2000 as a Liberal Democrat MP for Romsey. She served in Parliament until 2010. After leaving Parliament, she entered pharmacy politics, and following a spell chairing the English Pharmacy Board, became president of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in 2019. We are delighted that she's here this evening to reflect on the NPA centenary and our common goal of promoting community pharmacy. I think it's also important that we don't forget that the pharmacy teams out there who've also stood fast in the pandemic. We've got obviously our fantastic technicians who, clearly we owe a debt of gratitude to supporting the team efforts. We've got the drivers out there. We've got the dispensers, the pre-regs. The whole pharmacy team really needs to be celebrated here. But I'm going to go to Sandra now. Thank her, for coming to this evening. And the floor is yours, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and I'm glad I didn't do a pre-record. And as you can imagine, my speech has been expanding and contracting. But never say never, because I swore years ago that I'd never get involved in pharmacy politics. So life takes you in funny turns. But listening to Ian's comments earlier, I just thought, actually, it's very generous of you at the NPA to invite myself as president of the RPS when we're actually celebrating you breaking away from us. But I think the theme of what I want to say is about the importance of joint work and collaboration. And as always, when I look at something historical, I look at the year involved. There wasn't anything particularly exciting about 1921. Well, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, which was quite something, I think, if you're interested in that. Hitler became leader of his party. I wonder what happened to him. The most popular film was Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So on some better news, the NPA was formed, or the predecessor. And I think we probably all have personal memories of the NPA as well. And certainly as a new pharmacist working for what were then fairly small chains generally, my first memories were those infamous pink pages, which always contained useful information. But I am amazed that we are celebrating 100 years of the NPA without mentioning their magnificent helpline, because it was always a challenge. Whenever you rang, you always got an answer. And when I started locums, I must admit, I kept a few little codes and things in my handbag so that I could get through. A bit naughty of me to admit that now. But Ian pointed out how the organisation has changed over the years. And whilst at the time, I think I was very pleased to see that all of the pharmacy family were part of the NPA, I think with the exception of the co-op, if I'm right. It is clear that the independent sector does need a strong voice. So I'm delighted that the NPA is celebrating its 100th birthday and is clearly here to stay. And I wish you well for the next 100 years, but I'm going to make a tiny plea that we all continue on the work we've been doing over the past few years to work collaboratively. That work has started. I'm not suggesting something new, but I think it's something we can build on. Certainly when I was board chair, I forged links with the other organisations. I'm delighted to say that the chief execs of all of the pharmacy organisations work closely together. And pharmacy is quite a small and incestuous, in the nicest possible way, profession. We all know each other and there are overlaps. And in looking at a little bit of the history, it's notable how many people have been prominent persona in the NPA or NPU and also in RPS, none less than our own chief executive, Paul Bennett, who was once the chair of the NPA. So there are many and strong links, and may they continue. So pharmacy faces a lot of challenges, and I think it's been good to see the NPA come into its own, I think, over the last few years. And that was, I think, really kicked off by Ian Strachan in particular, when he chaired the NPA. And at the time of the pharmacy cuts, that was when the organisation started to come together. We all worked in different ways, and they were not always evident to the profession at large. But those of us who were involved were all working very closely together to try and make the best of things. And I think we need to probably communicate that better to all of our members and all of our organisations that work is going on, because the constant cry we see in the Twitter sphere and places like that is that we don't, and those of us who work together find that quite frustrating. So I suppose my plea is for a little bit more promotion of what we do. Because at the moment, pharmacy faces many challenges. Many of us on this call were, on this call now, we're actually on a call earlier today where with politicians thinking about the future of pharmacy. Now, I want the NPA to be here in 100 years, and RPS is 180 this year. I want us to be here in 200 years. But the more we can work together, the better. And I hope that is something that can be agreed by us all. And I'm actually going to end on two political quotes, but they're American politicians, and you can relax because I'm not using a quote by Trump. So the first quote is from Harry Truman, who says, "It's amazing what you can achieve if you don't care who gets the credit." And I think that's a timely reminder that the beauty of community pharmacy is that actually at heart, we all do it because we care about the patient and want what is best for the patient. So if we can all work together to achieve that, it doesn't necessarily matter that if nobody gets total credit, because we all play our part. And I want to end by a quote from one of my favourite politicians, Barack Obama, who says, "Our destiny is not written for us, it is written by us." So I look forward to, well, not personally me, but I certainly on behalf of the organisation, further cooperation over future years, and wish the NPA a happy birthday and a happy further 100 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra, for that. Thank you for your reflections and your plea to work collaboratively. So much appreciated. Certainly my own ambition for the NPA that we've got to work collaboratively to achieve anything. And I think some of the quotes there that you've just provided, you know, we obviously care about the patient. I think all of community pharmacy cares about the patient. And that's been demonstrated massively in this last year that we've had during the pandemic. You know, we've always put the patient first, which I think if we continue to do that, then we will eventually get recognised by our paymasters. And, you know, obviously our destiny, as you've just described, is written by us. So, you know, we can't blame anybody else if it doesn't work. It's our destiny and we write it. You're absolutely right to quote Barack Obama on that. I'm going to just move to some of the fundraising that we're going to be doing this year. We're looking forward to raising funds for the three great mental health charities, as I described earlier. These are the Scottish Association for Mental Health, Inspire Wellbeing in Northern Ireland, and Mind in England, which supports people in England and Wales. In the next few weeks, we'll let you know how you can get involved in that. Right now, we were going to play, obviously, the video of the charities, which we hope that will work now. The Mind video is going to come up.
We're Mind, the mental health charity. We're here to make sure everybody with a mental health problem has somewhere to turn for advice and support. In the past, people thought if you had a mental health problem, you would never feel better. You might meet people who still feel this. Maybe you feel this way about yourself. Mental health is just like physical health. Everybody has it and needs to look after it. You have good mental health if you're able to think, feel, and react in the ways that you need and want. You might need support with your mental health if you are finding the way you're thinking, feeling, or reacting is more difficult or even impossible to cope with. This might be because of things that are happening in your life right now. A traumatic event may affect your mental health in a big way too. even years later. We are all different. Everybody experiences a huge variety of feelings, thoughts and emotions as part of their normal life. But how and when we have them can be really different depending on who we are. Some of us can find these harder to cope with. This can be because of our upbringing and childhood, past experiences, or the things happening in our lives right now. That's why it's important that only you, someone who knows you really well, or someone who is qualified, gets to say when you need help. If your feelings, thoughts and reactions are getting in the way of how you want to live, if you feel things aren't right, if you feel like you need help, you can ask for it. We're not going to pretend it's easy. Mental health problems can change your life, and for some they can be overwhelming. But that's why Mind is here. We're going to face it with you. We'll listen, give support and fight your corner. To find out more, visit mind.org.uk.
So we're going to be announcing details of how you can get involved in our activities with Mind, SAMH and Inspire very soon. I'd also like to draw your attention to the member case studies which we are collecting as part of our centenary, and already a number of members have told their stories, and these were going to be published on the website, of course. So please get in touch with the team if you'd like to be part of that project. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers for joining us this evening. Hopefully we've provided a really good summary of where the NPA has come from, and hopefully you'll see that we are clearly going to be filling some shoes here for the future, that we hopefully will be delivering all of the services to patients that Rena pointed out on the message earlier on. So again, once again, thank you very much. And we finally look forward to continuing to mark our centenary with our members throughout the year. You'll be hearing through the emails and various social media the dates of those that will be announced in the coming weeks. So we look forward to hearing you joining us at those events. So once again, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Lots of familiar names in the attendee list. So again, personal thanks to all of those of you who I know personally, and hopefully you'll join us again at the next one. So thanks very much and good evening.